right, everyone. Hopefully you have had the opportunity to take a short break and you're back and ready to go again. We just have a little bit more time together. And as we close out the day, we want to take advantage of the fact that a cohort truly is a learning community, right? We want to learn from each other and we want to learn from our coaches. Our coaches have years of ministry experience, but not only that, have been engaging with this content for a lot of years now, and have been implementing it in their own contexts in different ways. And so we want to learn from them in this season, and so we're going to ask them to share some practical tips and practical stories of how they've seen this at work. And so we're going to first invite Keegan to be the leadoff batter here. I know Keegan's a big baseball fan, so we'll use a little bit of baseball metaphor here. And so Keegan, yes, share a little bit about your experience with this and the story that our cohort can learn from.
All right, thanks, Andy. So apparently that was the theme a little bit for Jake, is that I'm the storyteller. So how fitting that I would actually tell you all a story that hopefully would link to some practical realities for you all. One of the things that Scott Cormode talked about when I went through the journey several years ago was to go back to your context and find a story that is at work. Thanks, Zach. To tell a story, find stories where these intergenerational examples already existed and start telling those stories. And so that was the first step that I took. Was I went back and just began to listen. And I eventually uncovered 3 stories that were intergenerational connections already existed. And I started telling those stories everywhere. So much so that eventually I was telling them in staff meetings and board meetings and in the pulpit and at Sunday school potlucks and all those kind of things. And eventually people started saying, you've told this story so many times. When are you going to stop telling them? And I always said, when you give me another story to tell. So I was always trying to invite people to take the content and get excited about it and jump in. Well, one of the things that I realized was the power of storytelling and how we as people are always different every time we hear a story, whether that story is a good story, a disheartening story, or one that just breaks our heart and makes us mad. We're different people when we hear stories. And so one of those things that I realized is that I wanted to captivate storytelling into the life of my ministry without me being the storyteller, as much as I love to do that. And so one of the things I started doing is every month on a regular basis on my calendar, I started hanging out and sharing a meal with a senior adult. And the only question I ever asked was, tell me your story, tell me your faith journey, tell me what I need to know about you. And one thing I've learned is that people love to talk about themselves. So if we give them the space to do that, they love to tell story. And when you frame that story, sometimes you learn a whole lot about yourself and them and faith and process. One of those ladies was the name of Ginny. Ginny was 83 years old and she was on staff with us. And she just worked a part-time working on as an accountant and working on numbers. And so I took Ginny out to lunch and I asked Ginny, tell me your faith story, Ginny. And I was blown away by what she shared with me in the next few minutes. So I told Ginny, one of the things I started doing in youth ministry, because my leverage of change came with the area where I was granted permission to lead. And so I started doing what I called story sharing Sundays on the last Sunday of every month during our Sunday school hour. And I would bring one of these senior adults to come in and share their story of faith. That's what I did. And oftentimes the students kind of rolled their eyes because they knew they were hearing from another old person. But what I learned is that I got tired of young people or old people saying, older generations saying the future of church going to hell in a handbasket because of teenagers today. And then I got tired of teenagers saying, old people have nothing to offer me about faith. They don't know what the world is like today. And so I realized that we avoid what we don't understand. So I just intentionally engage them in space together. So Ginny showed up and I told Jenny, listen, one of the things about sharing your story is that your vulnerability is going to really have power in the lives of these kids. So don't stand up there and say, well, when I was 17, I made mistakes. Every kid in the room, when you say that, is going, what did you do at 17 that changed everything? And so I just told her to be honest and vulnerable. So Ginny said she'd do that. She got up in front of the students and I said, this is Ginny. It's story sharing Sunday. Most of the kids sat on their phone and rolled their eyes and like, here we go again. And I said, you're going to be different as soon as you hear Ginny's story. Ginny got up and said, so I got married when I was 18. And 3 months after I got married, I got pregnant. And 6 months into that pregnancy, I was 9 months married. I was 6 months pregnant. My husband walked into the room and said, "Honey, I don't feel all that well," and fell dead at my feet. She said, "So here I was. I'd been married for 9 months. I was 6 months pregnant with my first kid, and I just became widowed." She goes, "Subsequently, I had my child, and a few years after that, met a man in our church, and we started dating and eventually got married. And after a couple of years of marriage, I was 25, and then a word came out that he was fooling around with several kids in the youth group. So by the age of 25, I'd been divorced, I'd been widowed, and I was a single mom. Now all of a sudden the kids were off their phones and like leaning in a little bit. And then she said, now my third marriage has lasted the longest. I'm 83 years old, except for the last 15 years, my husband doesn't even know my first name." And the kids were silent. And then she looked up and looked at all those kids and said, "But let me tell you about the faithfulness of God in the midst of all my heartache." She says, "I know I'm 83 years old. I don't know what it's like to navigate the world that you're in. You deal with more than I've ever had to deal with. But I know you have struggles like I've had struggles. But let me tell you about the faithfulness of God in the midst of all of our struggles together." And sat down. All the kids were dead silent. They didn't know what to do. And so I got up and I didn't have to say anything. All I said was, "Guys, this is Ginny. Ginny loves Jesus. She's had struggles in life. You have struggles in life. One thing you're not allowed to do from this point on is see Ginny in our church community and never call Ginny by name. And I'll tell you one thing, Ginny also wants to know your name and know a little bit about your story too. So now the ball's in your court. And we're going to be a better community, and our lives are different because we've shared the life of Ginny. Perhaps just listening to the stories and faithfulness of senior adults and integrating them in intentional spaces for them to share their stories could create a snowball effect that gets the ball rolling of intergen conversation on the life of your context. That's my story.
I'm not crying, you're crying. And yes, Keegan is the master storyteller. That's what we just learned. Well done, Keegan. And let's not miss the fact that what Keegan did was just simply create an environment in which relationships can be made, right? And can be developed. And God did the rest, right? And through the power of storytelling, through the power of personal experiences, and it's amazing what stories can do. And so one of the things that we always try to encourage you is to find those stories in your own context and tell them time and time again, as Keegan said, and allow God to really move in those stories. And we love it when that happens. So Keegan, thanks for sharing that. Heidi, I don't know how you're going to follow that, but wonder what your story might be.
Well, I was thinking, I never volunteer to let Keegan go first again. But my favorite story to share in this context is a story of keychain leadership that happened with us here at CTK. The year after our first go around in the Growing Young process, we had a young man who wanted to take on a service project, and that was something we did regularly. So we would pack meals with Rise Against Hunger. So it was something that we were already used to doing. And the powers that be were very happy to have a young person want to come in and work with them and work side by side with them to make this happen. And so he did that as part of his confirmation project for that year. And then COVID hit. And as we were talking about what things were going to look like, since obviously we were not going to all gather in a big gymnasium and pack food around the Rise Against Hunger process like we'd done in previous years, basically the social ministry group that was in charge of that decided that we just weren't going to do it. And Zach stepped up and said he didn't think that that was acceptable and that if they would support him, he would like to pursue figuring out an option. And so he on his own went out and contacted the organization and found out that they had created a safer warehouse space where people could be more separated, and they had air filtration and things like that, and they were still packing meals. And he put together a congregational group to go and pack meals in their warehouse space that during the last 2 years, actually. And he has since moved on, and the tradition continues here. But what I loved most about the whole interaction was that even when the adults had decided that this was not something that could happen, they were willing to allow this youth to take the lead. And there literally would not have been a program at all going forward if they hadn't handed those keys completely over to Zach, and that's what sustained it. So that's my story for Keychain Leadership.
And that's so such a great story of sharing leadership in places where young people are passionate, right? The thing that we see, or that I've seen churches make mistakes around Keychain Leadership, is they work out of the space of being in desperation, maybe, or even where they feel like they have to fill holes in the church. They look at their nominating form or look across the church and say, hey, we need volunteers in all these places. And so why not just put a young person in, right? If we have any young people in the church. But young people aren't just wanting to fill holes, and they will at times, but really young people want to work out of their passion and work out of the areas where they have some real desire in. And so what we saw in Zach in that case is that this is something that he was interested in, and he wanted to make that happen. And so that's awesome that your church was willing, and that it gave the support that Zach needed to make it happen. So thanks for sharing that, Heidi. The next person that we're going to ask is Lisette. Lisette, tell us about a story in your ministry context.
Sure. I think what comes to mind, and even as I've been hearing some of our churches talk and hearing about the things that we all inevitably wrestle with. One of the things that I remember Scott saying at some point in change management, everything was, there's a principle, right? That your framework affects outcome. What you build gets you somewhere, right? But the reality is there's usually a lot of different ways you can build a framework to still get to the same outcome. But where we get in trouble in church life is we get really hung up on the framework, right? And you'll hear things, and I was talking about this with one of our churches. Well, we've always done it this way, right? Or if we only did it like we used to do, we would get the result we would still want. Well, the reality is we won't. We're in a different world. But what is often not changed is actually the desired outcome. I think there's an agreement that we all have that we actually want people to know and love Jesus. We want them to be discipled well. We want them to have a faith that lasts a lifetime. We want young people to be a part of the church. We can usually agree on all those things. It's how we get there that gets us into trouble. But I was a 3 on the Enneagram before the Enneagram existed. And if I see a problem, I'm going to quickly tell you why what we're doing isn't working. And what I learned is that's not helpful. What's not helpful is to tell people why what we're doing isn't working. What is much more helpful is to remind people of the outcome we desire and invite people to go on a journey with you to try to see if you could build a framework that would get you there. And then you're not nearly so bothered by the color of the carpet, which has split churches, or the sound of the music. what you're concerned about is, man, we want to get there. And so when I went through Growing Young with our church, our team was really stuck on a few things. And we realized that we were arguing about a framework and about a design of a program. And when we could pull ourselves all the way out and say, man, if we could just ignore all of that and say, but this is what we hope for. And I think this is where those shared stories of future hope and all those things come from. But we all agree we want to get here. That wasn't the problem. Then the idea of getting to build together towards that became much easier. And so we as a team actually had to pull ourselves all the way out of the things we were working on. We came up with a totally different project, and we said, what if we could build together for that outcome? And we did. We worked on it together for the whole year. And all of a sudden, as a team, we were much more unified, but we got to be about the things that were most important. And so I think just for all of you, as you're thinking about changing things and working on things, remember the outcome's the most important. And if you can keep people oriented there, you don't get quite so stuck.
Yeah, thanks, Lisette. I mean, gosh, every one of us have dealt with those places where we get stuck, right? And if we can just keep our eyes on the end goal of, we want young people to be lifelong followers of Jesus, and how we get there doesn't really, well, I shouldn't say it doesn't really matter. It does matter, but but if we can keep our eyes on that, then how we get there can change and shift and be different than what it was in the past. So good. So thanks for sharing that good word. And so we're gonna finish up this section with Chuck, who is our senior director of training. But prior to joining FYI, was doing this, living it every day at a nearby church here in Pasadena. And so Chuck, share with us.
Yeah, living this out. What we continue to talk about right now is change. And I think we've lived through over the last 3.5 years, moments where change was thrust upon us. And what we're talking about here in Growing Young is an opportunity for us to change the church, and it's not being thrust upon us. At some level, we don't necessarily have to change much of anything. And how do we do that well? How do we do that with people, as opposed to thrust that upon people and make them shift and change in moments? And so one of the ways that we talk about that is just kind of experimenting on the margins, and not getting out in front of everybody and changing for change's sake. And so when our church was going through Growing Young and continuing to shift and figure out ways to get people in front of different generations, our older generation classes were being once again frustrated with youth, and that seems to be a theme in a lot of churches. And I've had that over multiple churches that I've worked at, where older generation folks didn't see kids around, or didn't know where they were, or hadn't connected with them. And so there was some frustration or wondering about whether or not we were discipling well. And I think what we did in Growing Young is we took the idea of wanting to get all of our kids in front of and with older adults, and we said, let's not put everybody out there in front of and with our Sunday school classes. Let's see if we can't create some experiments on the margin, and we'll utilize that term over time. Experiments on the margin that we can refine over time without making them the grand way that we're doing things new for the next millennium. We said, hey, we're going to try this thing over here, and so there's what we did. The high school director at the time and I sat down and we were talking about, how do we do this? And they decided that we were going to ask the senior adult classes about what they do and what they would love to do with their grandkids. And two ideas kind of bubbled to the top. And one of them was that they would love to teach their grandkids how to cook. And then the other one was that they would love to sit down and paint with their grandkids. And so we created opportunities with our high school leadership team to spend time with the leadership team of that Sunday school class. And they did this on Zoom. And so we bought all the groceries for them to cook one of the simple meals that the adults had, and they led us through how to do that. And it was just an opportunity for them to understand who they were and get in front of kids and hear little bits about their stories. And we asked 5 questions during that time that everybody had to answer while food was cooking and things were, slowed down in the cooking time. And so that was one way that we kind of thought through, like, how do we do that? It got exciting for a moment, and the kids started loving it because they were like, one, I learned a skill that I don't want to learn from my parents, and two, there was a moment where the kids got something to eat in it as well, and it was a pretty cheap opportunity. The other opportunity was painting, and it was cheap for us to go to the local paint store and buy a bunch of canvases and some paint and distribute those, and we watched one of those videos, the painting videos, and had kids and adults kind of paint and then share why they painted what they painted, or what was the reasons why they chose particular paints and color schemes or around particular paints, and it provided opportunities to engage. But once again, we didn't do that with the whole youth ministry of 150 kids. We did that with 5 kids and 5 adults in the space. And when we rolled it out, we had an opportunity to ask those 10 people who had already participated to help get people to come and do that. And they were able to tell a story about, man, we had so much fun, and this is what we created, and this is what we ate. And so it became a marketing piece, which we hadn't planned for, but that's what it had become. And it really provided an opportunity for our older generation adults to connect with our youth. And so experimenting on the margins in small spaces like that to do things really, really important as you move this process forward.
And yeah, we're gonna keep reminding you of experimenting on the margins, meaning that if it has a tagline and a logo, that probably isn't experimenting on the margins. That's probably too much in front of a larger group, because a small experiment, if it fails, it's not going to be detrimental to anything, right? But when it succeeds and it creates stories, that's when you can share those stories again and again, as we've already mentioned. So we really want you to think about, how do you experiment on the margins where you can mine for those important stories that you can tell time and time again. So thanks, Chuck, for reminding us of that. And actually, I'm just going to throw it right back to you.
Yeah, actually. So as we continue to come to a close in this space, we want to give you kind of the next steps and how to process and where to go from here between now and the next summit. And part of that is just really engaging in the material and setting yourselves up for success in this. So number one, turn to page 13 in your packet. And here are some tips that we suggest that you do as you engage. So it's really great to see a bunch of your churches and your teams here with you. I'm expecting that some of those are mostly staff teams. And the first thought is expand your growing young team. Expand the people that can speak into this process with you. I'm just going to read part of that. In addition to your team at the summit, the folks that are here, consider forming a larger team of perhaps, 6 to 12 people. I think 12 is too big. I would stay towards 8, but that's just me. Who can support your work. Members of this team might be actively involved in this work or can be kept informed of the progress and advise you of your direction. And we recommend that this is a diverse, intergenerational, cross-functional team. You might want to consider involving teenagers, young adults, your youth ministry or young adult ministry, volunteers or staff, senior leadership, parents, board members, just broaden that team. Some of you already have those teams that are functioning in your church. And you might want to say, hey, you know what, why don't we step into this as a project? I knew for us, we had a parent ministry team already in place. And I said, you know what, we need to shift right now. And let's invite a couple more people to join us in this process of shifting. And so pray over that. Don't just go lead this process and go, hey, we're gonna invite everybody to come into this this process. But pray over what you guys are going to do and how you're going to invite people to help you engage this information. This isn't just a learning thing for you all. This isn't thing just to put in your back pocket. It's something to really try and figure out how you function and care for it in your church. Number 2 is launch a listening project. Now and through the summer, think through a project that you can do that is listening. We've got some interviews and focus groups on pages 14 and 15, kind of following this page, of how to do some listening with your teenagers, with your adults, to really center in on what their felt needs are and how you can approach those from a growing young standpoint. You might want to make plans to kind of upgrade your assessments, not only from the team version to the church version. You can figure out how to do that by going to your dashboard and figuring out how to ask those questions, broadly speaking, of your church and of your youth ministry, so that you can have more information about what are the things that you need to do, next steps that are going to really impact your church and your community in this particular moment. The listening project really is one of the foundational pieces to this whole entire project. And if you do that well, you're going to move forward really well, because you're going to have good information by which to act on moving forward. Number 3 is experiment on the margins. I just gave you a story about that. You want to think through your sphere of influence and what you can experiment with, where the most people won't notice if things don't go well. What are the experiments? And believe me, I gave you a story about a moment when things went well. I can tell you 10 more stories about things that didn't go well. But one of the things that we gave ourselves permission to do was fail in the margins. And you've got to give your team and yourself permission to fail in the margins and try stuff that is going to connect people. And it may work for some individuals, it may not work for other individuals, but for the most part, you're trying things that are going to bring more people together and are going to connect people over the long haul. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do this in secret. Keep your leaders abreast of what's happening and keep them informed of how you're talking about things and what you're doing. Don't just spring this on your senior pastor and say, hey, we've been trying this thing over here and we want to introduce it to the church, and it's that we're going to have all of our kids come into worship service with flags and palms every single week, because we have been practicing it over here on our thing. Not that you would do that, but don't spring these things on your senior leaders. And then lastly, revisit and update your church transformation plan. What you did and the work that you've done so far is going to change multiple times over, especially as you invite more people, especially as you experiments, especially as you listen. Continue to refine that church transformation plan. It is a plan. It is not the whole entire outcome. Like Lisette was talking about earlier, you haven't created an outcome. You're just creating a plan. And if you know anything about plans, especially when you're talking about Jesus, that plan is going to change tomorrow. And Jesus is going to change that plan tomorrow. So continue to stay connected to a plan so that you can continue to move forward. But for the most part, you're going to continue to work through that plan and change that plan so you have opportunities to move. Revisit it probably once a month. You want to gather your people between now and the next summit for sure, and see whether or not you can expand that group of people that are going to help you shift your church and shift the operating idea around your church. You can read all that stuff there. If you have more questions, you're going to email all of that stuff to Zach or reach out to your coaches. I'm going to continue to push you to your coaches. These people have been in the trenches. They know what's going on. They've got great insight and information for you. Some great leaders we've got for you in Heidi and Lisette and Keegan. Please utilize them as much as possible in this process. I'm going to throw it back over to Zach. He's going to give you some last things before we leave, and we're going to continue to move this forward.
All righty, so we are gonna go ahead and give some last minute instructions. But first, we do need to take a very short summit evaluation. So I'm gonna share my screen here. There's a QR code you can use. If you prefer to click on links, you can go ahead and click on that link in the chat. And we're just going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to fill out this survey. This helps us know how to improve things next time we do this. We do our best to listen, but also some of your next steps. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, and I'm going to play some music for you all. All righty, thank you so much for doing that. A couple more things as we wrap up here. The first is, if you would, if you don't already get our emails and you would like to, we send out, we write blogs, we send out a weekly kind of summary of our latest resources and things like this. Our blogs are pretty practical, give you ideas that you can use today, this week. So we highly encourage that. You can go ahead and sign up for that at that link, or of course you can just go to our website and do that as well. So in addition to the next steps, the check listed, here's a flexible calendar to keep you moving forward. Emphasis on flexible. Find something that works for you. This is our suggestion to help you keep on track, but we do know some of you are doing things just a little bit differently. Whatever works best for your team. Do talk to your coach about that. Your coaches have some insight into rhythms that have worked for other teams over time. And so they are a great resource for this. But February, do spend time in the next 1 to 2 weeks and complete your church transformation plan. I would imagine you may have gotten through pages 1 and maybe 2. You may have pages 3 and 4, which would be 9, 10, pages 11 and 12 to go through. You may need to do spend more time on the new and the how. So meet in the next couple weeks, finish that up, and then starting in March, you'll be invited to continue and finish the 6 Growing Young Essentials e-course. We have a webinar in March, and then a coaching group call in April. And then our next summit is in May. So at that point, or at this point in time, those are your next steps. You have kind of your marching orders here. I want to pause for any questions that anybody may have. Are there questions about what you should be doing, or any questions that others may be of interest to others? You can put those in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have a question about the church assessment. We did the team assessment. I guess I don't have clarity as to when we should have those church assessments done by. What's the recommended time again?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. Thanks so much, Sam. So the church assessment is it's the exact same thing that you took with the team assessment. It's the same questions, all that, but it goes out to the entire church. So we're going to recommend that sometime in maybe the next 6 or so months. So there's a lot of flexibility. In May, we'll start a second church transformation plan with a little bit more detail in it. Some of you may want to do this sooner rather than later because it works with your church's schedule. Some of you may want to wait until the summer when there's a little bit more flexibility. Our recommendation would probably be sometime in the next 6 months, either this spring or in the summer, and use that as one element of your listening project. I'd encourage you, if you wait on the assessment, to start listening now, start one-on-one conversations, start focus groups, whatever that looks like. There are lots of different ways, but start listening right away. Listening is really important. Listening is easy is not the right word, but it's something you can do immediately, and then figure out how the assessment is going to fit into that. So sometime in the next 6 months. Some of you are going to say, I can't do it in the next 6 months. I need to do it another time. That's okay. Talk to your coach about that. Some of you may do it after the cohort ends. Some of you may do it in the fall. That can all fit into a great strategy, a great plan, depending upon where your church is at. So there's a lot of flexibility, but you're looking at sometime in the next 6 months. It usually takes anywhere between 3 and 6 weeks, depending upon how you administer it, to do that well. You do want to make sure that you show up in a lot of different places to get people that can take it. You can send it via email out to people, but you can also have opportunities at small groups and Bible studies and Sunday mornings, worship services, things like that. So you want to make sure you get that in front of people's eyes in as many different places as possible. Yeah, great question. And again, talk to your coach with questions about strategy behind that, or you can talk to me too. Any other questions? All right. As always, we will communicate all of this in many, many different ways. It is so good to see you all and your teams. We pray for you. We pray for you often. And we want you to know that. Yeah, I have asked Lisette to close us in prayer and to send us on our way in the Spirit.
Sounds good.
I did have one last question, if I may, actually.
Oh, yeah.
I have the resources for the sermon series. Is there a recommendation of when to do that throughout the year? Like to do a sermon series based on the Growing Young curriculum or training?
Yes, there is no recommendation for that because that really depends upon your church transformation plan and upon where your church is at and all those questions. Some prefer to do that earlier in the process, some wait until after. So talk with your coach about that, talk with your leadership team about that. And it depends upon when you want to start talking about Growing Young a little more broadly.
right,
And
thank
so, yeah. And we do have all 6 sermons available. We were just talking about when we want to talk about that as a team. There are only 2 available on the website. All 6 are written. We will get those to you.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know that what we're talking about, that's coming to you at the next summit. And after the next summit, kind of in the process. So anyway, all the things. Lisette, you're on.
Would love to. All right, friends, let's pray. It's been a full day. It has been a full day. Father God, we are so grateful for the chance to be together. God, I'm grateful for each and every leader here that has just made a commitment to say, how do we help more people get to know you? How do we help your church thrive? And so, God, I really pray as we think even on that incredible line that leaders are listeners first, God, that we would listen to you first. God, help us to be attentive to what you're up to. God, give us fresh eyes as we walk back through our communities and into our churches. Give us ears to hear. Help us to listen well and to get a sense of the heartbeat of what is happening and, God, what you are speaking into the midst of all of that. God, give us incredible creativity. Help us to see things we've never seen before. God, give us wisdom and discernment to know when and how to speak and what and how to ask. God, help us to just be mindful and thoughtful as we lead. And God, would you give us courage to experiment, to make bold decisions and to try different things that maybe feel wild, but God, give us spaces and places to wisely experiment some things, all for your glory, God. And so would you bless these leaders? Would you encourage them as they go about the rest of their day? And God, would you help us to look more like you so that we can help a generation know you? It's in your name we pray. Amen.